Okay, so as expected, the British media establishment has not turned up. They've actually refused to debate, which in this instance is really just they've refused to present two sides of the news, which is very unusual since they do pride themselves on sort of both sidesing every issue, except for this one. This one, we've got the one side of the story, so we will be taking it upon ourselves to present perhaps the other side of the story, or really just kind of facts and actual information for those of you who are less familiar with what's going on. First, I will bring on, I guess, my co-host this evening. It's unusual for us to be here at night, but the woke sorcerer is with us. Hello.
Hi, Eric. How are you doing?
Good. It's nice to see you in the evening time. Normally I've got my coffee, but it's public.
Yeah. I've got my alcohol-free beer. Thank you. I'm here to represent cisgendered women everywhere, all of them.
Which is good, because there was that time I by not platforming a woman, I was deplatforming all women at one stage.
Yeah.
When I invited Matt Goodman to the first one, but it's wonderful to see you.
You too.
And we've actually got a very special return to the program. We've got Doc Phoenix is coming back onto Free Speech Live. Hello, Phoenix.
Hello. I'm here to say hello to all of my anti-fans who are hate watching this, but also to the regular viewers, because I've missed you.
Yes. Well, I have no doubt that between the three of us, we've got a lot of hate watchers going. We'd have to check Mumsnet for the reviews of this.
Or that special harassment Twitter account that we shan't name, but just really, really likes to pick on early career researchers.
Yes. And that's actually going to be what we will discuss. And because we were not necessarily expecting the British media establishment to turn up, we did arrange for Christa Peterson to join us. So, Christa, hello.
I guess I'm representing the British media establishment.
Please, God, no.
Hi.
Hello, and you're joining us from a different continent. Is that right?
Yes, I'm in New York.
Great. But normally, I think one of the reasons we went with 7 was normally you're on the West Coast. Is that right?
That's true. I said I was going to be on the West Coast, but that was a lie.
It's fine.
So, thank you, everyone, for coming.
No, it's great. And what we normally do is we run through the top 3 news items of the week. And I'm sure there are some. I'm sure there's some national trusts. There's those Florida lawyers, the academics who are banned from speaking. But we'll maybe pick up with some of those next week. So we'll do our 3-week speech, but we'll just jump right in. But I will play our very nifty news intro before we start. Okay. So the top news that we will be looking at this week is obviously the self-cancellation, the self-deplatforming of Kathleen Stock, which I think not many of us were expecting on that particular day, I guess. Was anyone expecting it in general?
Yeah,
yes.
I think so.
Yeah, I was expecting at some point an attempt at a constructive unfair dismissal case, or a settling to avoid that. Particularly once Joe Phoenix had kind of set her crowdfunder in motion.
Right. So is it just more lucrative, I suppose, to be fully canceled, to go the full Bogosian,
Well,
and
if
just
your supporters are leaving
resign, but
the
present it
university-
as a cancellation?
if the people who support you are leaving the university,
Yeah.
then it's like either you go with them, or if you want to double the cash, then you settle and leave, and then you still go with them because magically he rides to the rescue on a white horse and says, "Oh yes, here's your special chair here after you've done your stint as free speech staff for the government or whatever."
Yeah, do you think that she will be free speech? Sorry.
I think they'll ask.
Yeah.
I don't
I
know
see,
that she wants it.
Michelle Donnellan has called for her to be compulsory platformed somewhere else, so hasn't she?
That's right.
And said
I've
that she
never
should
seen that
be-
before. I've never seen a government minister ever call for an individual academic to be hired.
Yeah, so this was a tweet, right?
Yeah,
That she tweeted out that someone should hire Kathleen Stock at
Yeah.
Spring University.
like I've seen obviously like general sometimes, it would be a shame if people didn't hire, heterodox economists or historians who pay proper attention to the importance of how great the empire is or whatever. But I've never seen ever in years of looking at this stuff that before.
I think as early career researchers as well, it's a little bit galling when we spend all our time on jobs.act.uc
Because it's a bit like
applying for jobs that we don't get, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's also a bit like, will any university hire Kathleen Stock? And it's like, yes, the University of Sussex. Like they didn't. She had a job presumably until hours before that she gave up.
Yeah, and voluble statements of support. And when she got her OBE, the head of school, who I have met before because I had a job interview with her before, she wrote a comment in support of the OBE. I mean, it wasn't like sneaked out, because normally when stuff happens where you get external recognition and you work at a university, you're sort of lucky if they put it up on the university blog. Like, generally, if you're the sort of person who's doing well outside the university, unless you've got a big TV show or something like that, everyone is just like, it's not as good as people in here liking you. If you're externally recognized, you tend to be internally not particularly well thought of, whatever stage of your career you're at. So to kind of get not just the VC or, the head of the media team at the university to praise you for getting the OBE, but multiple people were quoted in that statement when she got the OBE, that shows that there was definitely support within the university. So unless every single person who signed that off has left, then they definitely would still hire her. I mean, she would probably have to go through an internal investigation, not to do with the harassment that she has faced, and then the harassment that we have receipts on that she is.
Yes, and that will be.
People, but like that doesn't mean that she would necessarily lose her job, because she's broken all the policies before, and as stated by Sussex, because I did used to work there.
Right.
And that there not being consequences. So I wouldn't see that she would be sacked even if she went through a full investigation procedure.
No. I mean, well, yeah.
But
I think it's still interesting that last time, it was about 2 weeks ago, we ran through the coverage at that stage, and at that point, she still had her job, and there was maybe the second protest. And at that point, there were people just reporting crimes off of the I got that from Christa, actually. Can you say a bit more about the crime reporting, the kind of neighborhood watch via social media?
Yeah, so the gender criminals, it's kind of like they are Gamergate, but like more middle-aged and ladies. And I think when a member of the movement, they're super mobilized, and they're not going to SWAT you, but they will apparently file police reports. It started, I think, lots of them are mad about that you can report like a hate incident, and that whether it is recorded as one is based on the victim's perception of it as something. So I think they started off reporting it as a hate incident, and then some of them got responses saying it was a civil matter. And then because of that, they escalated, and people were talking about reporting it as stalking. and as threats, all this stuff.
And this is the protest. I mean, they
Yes,
were reporting
yes,
the
so they were-
protest, which we've all seen footage of.
The protest, also the Instagram they were reporting. There was
With the 4 posts.
Yeah, there was in the statement the students said like the comment about, like, get mad, we'll be here or something.
Yeah, we'll see you around or something.
Yeah, that was the threat that they were reporting. So it wasn't just that they were filing the reports, but what they described themselves as filing the reports about was this stuff that was publicly visible that we could look at and see it was not what they were calling it.
And that presumably the police
hilarious because they were reported to
see.
police, and it was actual crime stuff they did to me that wasn't hate incidents.
Well,
there just isn't a budget to kind of. I mean, obviously we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute.
It's the fact that they were that it's the hypocrisy or inconsistency that tends to bother me. The fact that they really want to debate, but you can't debate them because they don't want any criticism. They really are free speech absolutists, and you must not silence any free speech. But as soon as you protest anything, they absolutely must shut that down. And they support a campaign called Fair Cop that is run by lawyer Sarah Phillimore, the gender critical lawyer Sarah Phillimore, who just loves libeling people. I don't know why. And a former police officer, Harry Miller, who is the joint CEO of Lawrence Fox, former friend of the show.
Oh, classic.
His political party Reclaim, which is funded by Jeremy Hosking, who's funded loads of Brexit stuff,
and it's kind of
the piece of
reform,
the weekend about him funding anti-climate stuff. Fair Cop are campaigning against hate crimes and hate incidents, and they're starting with hate incidents and saying that they shouldn't be recorded at all. And then they're like, hate crimes shouldn't really exist, but if they do exist, you shouldn't really.
And yet they're very happy to report crimes.
But yeah, exactly, they're very happy to do that. It's like the people who speak out most about free speech and slaps. And say that slaps in other countries shouldn't happen, trying to because of our libel laws in this country, and in other countries it's a detriment to free speech and to the freedom of the press, but they say nothing when J.K. Rowling does a slap, and they're very litigious themselves.
Yes.
I spoke to an academic
and that's actually
today who's faced multiple lawsuits from people who frequently say that nobody should be litigious and free speech is really important.
Yes, and that actually is a great segue into Grace Lavery's campaign, which I recorded an interview with Grace yesterday, so that'll be interesting for us to see. But just before we do that, what I did want to point out was that even though Stock has resigned, the media is still going on with this narrative that she's been sort of silenced and that she's been pushed out, and you've got the government saying this is terrible. Apparently, satire has been killed entirely.
Okay. There was another peer today in the Times saying that it's dreadful, and
there was also the I forget, was it Rachel Cook over the weekend saying, "Remember the good old days when people talked about other people behind their backs," and it's sort of like that. Well, isn't that exactly what the complaint is?
The whole thing.
She was the Woman of the Year. I mean, she did literally say in response to being Stockton's resignation thing from the Sussex.
Yeah.
She thinks that no one can argue in universities. It's like, this woman hasn't been to a departmental meeting, has she? Or like literally any meeting. But apparently her dad's an academic.
What biscuits you're going to have. I mean, that's academics and students love beef. I mean, there is nothing but beef in universities.
It's like, have you looked at Twitter? But her dad's an academic, so she knows about it completely because her dad's an academic. So there we are.
How old is she? Isn't she in her 50s? How old? How emeritus is her dad?
I'm not sure, but the idea that there's no argument in academia anymore, and also the amount of headlines that are just sort of like, people shouldn't be offended. And it gets to the issue of like, what are we talking about? This is someone who gets criticized and gets so offended that they start throwing threats of lawsuits around at anyone.
Well, also, like, if nobody can be offended, then why are they so offended by the student protest?
Well, exactly. That's what I mean. It's like, where are the standards and so forth? But Without further ado, because we do have some things to get to, I did want to bring in this this interview I did with Grace, because Grace obviously has done some, I suppose, investigation into the students' claims, because, and as we'll see, it sort of started with just an innocuous kind of observation of the way the Sussex students was treated on the BBC. But that's one of the reasons why the media has been invited today, although they didn't turn up. Is that, you know, it would be nice to get some reporting on this, regardless of the position you have on this, because as we can see, it's still very one-sided. So if it's okay with all of you, I will bring this up, and then we'll be interested to hear what Grace has to say. Okay. Well, thank you again for joining us, Grace. And what I was interested in was kind of when you first became aware of what was happening at Sussex. Kind of, did you immediately figure out what was going on, or did it take some time?
Yeah, I think I became aware in different stages. So I think the first thing that I remember was a few years ago, Kathleen Stock, along with a number of other colleagues, published a manifesto that was called Doing Better in Conversations About Sex and Gender, if I remember rightly. And the purpose of that manifesto was to kind of provide something like a sort of liberal rationale for opposing trans civil rights claims. I think that was more or less the purpose of that document. And, you know, it was the first time that I'd seen any document like that. This was in 2019. So I quickly wrote a response, and I felt a little, I mean, it was, if I were doing this again, I would have spent a little longer on the response, because I didn't quite anticipate that it would be as widely read as it was. But nonetheless, I stand by everything I said in that document. But that piece became quite widely read. Kathleen Stock reached out to, and thinking about this now, this is actually an example of the same thing. Kathleen Stock reached out to me to demand a kind of correction on something that I hadn't stated in the first thing, which was this query about whether or not I'd heard her give a talk on Jane Eyre a few years previously, and she demanded that I retract the claim that I hadn't quite made. So I happily did, because I wasn't 100% sure about it. But then later on, it kind of turned out that indeed I had heard her give this talk, and she sort of confirmed it over email. So looking back at this, and again, I'm thinking of this only for the first time now, but I am among the people who has been threatened with a kind of retaliatory harassment on the basis of perfectly legitimate comment. Anyway, you know, this was years ago, and I didn't really think very much of it at the time. And in fact, you know, last year, 2020, Kathleen Stock had, you know, what struck me as the courage and presence of mind to defend me against defamatory claims that Graham Linehan had directed against me. And I emailed her to thank her, and we had a nice little correspondence then again. And then, you know, something seemed to shift later on last year when, you know, the strange thing, and it seemed to be around the kind of Tavistock-Bell, initial Tavistock-Bell decision. Sure. Professor Stock herself sort of repeated a kind of milder version of one of the claims that Linehan had made. You know, she said that there was something revolting about my interest in adolescent females, which was, right, you know, such a kind of dramatic escalation from anything I'd heard from her in the past. I was actually sort of, in addition to being horrified, I was quite surprised and quite kind of taken aback. And I emailed her to ask, you know, what had happened, and she never responded. So, you know, from then on, I guess we didn't really have much of a correspondence. But, you know, the more recent situation is all of the stuff that I've learned in the last few weeks, which has really, again, surprised me by the scale and intensity of the problem at Sussex. I did not, I didn't see it coming, and I was quite surprised. And I remember a very specific moment when I realized, oh, this is worse than people think, worse than I thought. Right. And that was when I heard Adam Tickell on the BBC Radio 4 interview saying that he found it disturbing that students were protesting a member of the academic staff, that there were going to be consequences that he didn't name what they would be for those students, that disciplinary action would be meted out upon these protesters. And I sort of thought, I have my own investments in this as an academic and as someone profoundly invested in academic freedom as a rubric and as an intellectual protocol. But even if I didn't, it's not right for academic administrators to be making those kinds of threats against students. That's not normal. That's not, even when things are going quite badly, that doesn't happen. And I say this as someone employed by the University of California, Berkeley. We have had our own struggles with these kinds of questions. But, when students protested Milo Yiannopoulos, no administrative staff went on the National Public Radio to decry those students and say that they were going to receive consequences for protesting Milo Yiannopoulos.
But I was struck by how quickly the protesters were sort of immediately represented as these threatening individuals who were clearly there to intimidate, and the media just went with that. And that's still the kind of factual basis everyone's working from, is that there was this threat from these protesters.
Yeah, and no one can quite tell me what that is, because again, I don't have any kind of institutional skin in the game at Sussex, so it's very easy for me to say, students shouldn't. I mean, nobody should be issuing threats of violence against Kathleen Stock or anyone. I mean, of course, I believe that very strongly,
sure.
and that may very well have happened. I don't know. I just haven't seen evidence for it, and I certainly don't understand how it's quickly become such a consensus. The most tactless thing I've seen from the students' account is that they put up an image that said "Ding dong, the witch is dead" when Stock resigned. I actually DM'd them to say I thought that was in poor taste. Clearly, it was something that they took from the Margaret Thatcher death. I remember that then, and I was annoyed by it then as someone who's marched against Thatcher and her acolytes. But no, the threats are really, if there are threats, and I don't want to deny the possibility there might be, I certainly don't see any evidence they're coming from students, and I think that's highly at odds with the claims that I've seen. However, it's perfectly in line with the attempts over the last few years, of which Professor Stock has been one of the major agents, to demonize and stigmatize trans students. That begins with TERF is a slur, and the notion that simply by referring to someone as a trans exclusionary radical feminist, one is, using a swear word of some kind, which is, clearly a rhetorical gesture designed to make it more difficult to communicate. But it also continues, when there was a talk at the London School of Economics a few months ago where a student had delivered a talk kind of, imaginatively working out what it might feel like to be the target of transphobia and transmisogyny. And one part of this talk it included some notion about, I think there was a line like, "You can feel my knife at you can feel my knife at your throat." Now, to me, and to I assume most people, the student was saying two things. Firstly, that the student feels that there is a knife at their own throat, and so there is a kind of phantasmatic reversal of that. And two, that the people opposing the students' civil rights claims are afraid. And one response to that fear is to kind of try to manifest it in some way. I'm not defending it as a tactic or as a piece of writing. I don't write that way, and I don't write that way for a reason. But literally hundreds of people, including academics, including scholars, argued that this was not only sort of unpublishable, but also an act of terrorism that warranted police investigation against the student. And again, I was staggered. I mean, when I saw that taking place on Twitter and the LSE kind of giving into it, I was stunned to see my colleagues labeling a student a terrorist for an imaginative piece of writing. Again, it's not normal. I've never seen anything like it in the history of the university. I keep asking for someone to give me an idea of something that's similar, but in
Yeah,
the UK,
I mean,
I just can't think of anything.
I think you're absolutely correct. I mean, so I think as we realized, I think Grace was still, and then really speedy, and then, but the sound was coming through, so hopefully that was of interest to you. But what I'm going to do is I'll publish the interview with Grace separately immediately after our discussion, but it'll also give us a chance while we have Christa here to get her and other sides of the situation. But what I discussed with Grace was essentially eventually getting into the insights about what the students were protesting about was not particularly, and this is fairly common, and the way the media represents this is that students are protesting over anyone saying, women are biologically female or some kind of like basic banal statement, and they're terrified that if they say that out loud they'll be immediately fired, and that's because that's what is being represented as stock is kind of being run out of town on a rail because of this her philosophical views. But in fact it's not. It's that she's signed the Declaration. I'm trying to remember the acronym.
Women Human Rights Declaration from the Women's Human Rights Campaign, which is quite a radical organization.
Yes, and I mean, Christa, of all the people, I mean, you've got the receipts, and you've sort of presented so much information about the fact that this isn't just a kind of philosophical claim or two. I mean, it's a pattern. But Grace eventually gets into the way that Stock uses vexatious lawsuits and threats and so forth to stop this criticism, particularly of students. And you are obviously a PhD student.
Yeah, I think my impression so far, it's just threats of lawsuits, and there has not been an actual, as far as I know. Yes, right. I'm a PhD student, and I'm one of the students that Grace has now spoken to. So now I feel like I kind of like occupy this weird space where I am like, semi-public on these stuff, and I don't know, whatever. It's like, it's not like I'm just like any random PhD student anymore, and that I think is fine with regard to like how people interact with me. Yeah, I mean, I think like many other people's experiences, the way she responds to my engagement is to try to dismiss it by portraying me as like generally like obsessive. Yeah, like it's like a mental health problem I have, which given that I'm a student is fairly inappropriate. But then I also had a more explicit experience of the kind of like hypocrisy around academic freedom, where some students in Stock's department invited me to give a talk at the same time she was giving a talk, which is like just a kind of classic like academic protest approach where you're not like contesting the other person's right to speak or something, but you're offering an alternative event kind of as a demonstration of not thinking that what they're doing is like necessarily worth listening to. So I was going to do that, and the students are the one who like actually had this direct contact. So this is, I hope I'm accurately representing everything, but they felt pressured by the department as a result of inviting me. They felt pressured to cancel the talk. They felt they were told that it could not be an anti-Kathleen talk. They were told that they needed to refamiliarize themselves with university guidelines that said that they had to treat faculty with respect. And they also were given the impression that they would be responsible for anything I said. So I was very nervous about getting them in trouble. So I reframed my talk from, it was originally going to be focused on the gender critical movement in philosophy, but I broadened it to the gender critical movement in academia. So I'd have more non-Kathleen Stock examples to talk about, because she's like, there's other gender critical philosophers, but she is by far the highest profile one. And I gave the talk. It was, I think, like fine. I expect that there was someone in the audience that was going to report back to the department, to Kathleen, about whether it had been like impermissibly anti-Kathleen, and no problems were raised. But still, she then later started posting about how I had given this like inappropriate talk where I went through her like intellect and character and motives, which did not happen. And kind of like rallying the troops. And now she has kind of repeatedly referenced this talk as part of the ways she was wronged at Sussex, which is just kind of, it's just an instance of someone else exercising academic freedom.
Right.
And
Yeah, and because because part of the premise is that there's no sort of debate or any time that this comes up, it's kind of, well, we'd love to have a debate, but it's the kind of gender ideology side that won't have these debates. And there you are. I mean, you're not literally in the room, but did she also cancel that talk, her own talk?
Yes, she did cancel the talk. She actually canceled it before the students were receiving this pressure to cancel theirs. So at that point, it was not because of the conflict anymore. It was an independent push to cancel this one. But yeah, and so I thought that she might come to mine and ask me questions, which was fine. But she didn't.
Can I just make a point actually about these ableist slurs that you've been receiving, Christa? Because I've noticed I have severe mental illness and I'm neurodivergent, so I feel that this is absolutely disgusting and inappropriate that you would be called, for example, a loony grad student by a certain gender critical.
Yeah, that was not Kathleen. But yeah, that was.
No, I know that was not by Professor Stock, but that has come from another gender critical academic.
Yeah, I think it was loony grad student, best ignored.
Yeah. And you've also it's been said by other people that you're, mentally ill. And it's like, right, so you think that this PhD student is mentally ill. Okay. And so you're going to continue to bully her on the internet, right? I mean, and this to me just illustrates why I'm very scared of gender critical people for myself, because I think that they actually don't like me very much either. So I just wanted to make that point because I think it's an important one, that this is not just about...
Can I jump in on this one? Because obviously I have my own experience, because I debated Kathleen Stock.
That's right. You've actually literally debated her.
Yeah, I've literally debated her, because the whole no debate thing actually originally comes from Stonewall saying that they didn't want to send particularly their trans representatives at the time, when they had trans workers quite high up in the organisation, to go and just basically be abused on a radio show or a TV show, because it didn't help anyone and they weren't treated with respect. But yes, so because the previous CEO of Index on Censorship was even more pro-gender critical than the current people at the organisation. And there are a lot of gender critical people at Index on Censorship, including Trevor Phillips, including editor of the magazine, Martin Bright. And there are quite a few people who both sides it. Kate Mulby is also gender critical. We used to be mutuals on Twitter, and then she just couldn't cope anymore with people being trans in her presence. Anyway, so yeah, when they had the previous CEO, they committed to being a respondent in the appeal for Maya Forster's case, to kind of speak on behalf of free speech. They weren't meant to be really commenting on the legitimacy of her views or anything like that. It was just like, she has a right to free speech, and if we let the law say that this belief that lots of people have is something you can't talk about, then it will restrict free speech. And because they've done this, they had like quite a lot of pressure from people who, well, from gender critical people saying, oh, well, you should do loads more stuff like about this, because when Ruth Smith took over as CEO of Censorship, she'd basically written a bunch of things on their website and said stuff elsewhere to say, look, we're basically just both siding it, kind of going, well, if we're going to actually be a free speech organization, then we don't both sides everything, and we don't both sides, like, we don't platform Assadists, we don't platform anti-Semites, but we do, if it's a view that both where lots of people are in our organisation or support our organisation, or on both sides of the argument, then we should show both sides of it, and we shouldn't just we should support J.K. Rowling if she's receiving abuse, to have some free speech, but we should also support trans people too. And the gender critical people went off at that, partly because it was a change of policy as far as they saw it, because they saw the previous CEO as very much an ally.
Like there is only one side, and it's people getting side. And so
So anyway, coming off the back of that, they asked me to. They needed a trans person, basically.
Because here it is.
Piece. Yeah.
Here it is. The debate. What is a woman?
To write, but they wanted a piece on each side that was written before the judgment came out in Maya's appeal, but came out after, which is deeply unfortunate.
Right. because you do reference, I guess, but I mean, there's Kathleen, and then immediately after, there you are.
Yeah, and in the print magazine, it's printed over several pages with a box that goes by Sally Gimson, who works for Index on Censorship, that went across the bottom of the kind of bits where the two pieces kind of interacted on the page. You know, because each article is several pages, and the bit where there's the end of her article and the start of my article, where I get the last word, there's a box that went over the bottom of
is that it
pages there? And I think it's in there, but that kind of just went, this is what happened in the case, to give people the overview. So it deliberately physically linked the two pieces in debate, and that's also how they were presented in the contents page of the physical magazine.
Right, and because it wasn't actually Stock who then took issue with this. I mean,
no, she didn't comment at all. She shared her piece, I shared mine. When we'd been sent our physical copy of the magazine, and we'd been told that it was online and it was going to be free to access online, not proper open access, but, you know, free to read online, for X amount of time. And when that amount of time had passed, I thought, everything is fine. Nobody's had a go at me. I've publicized it. Stock has publicized hers. And then somebody clearly sent Myra a copy. And obviously Stock didn't do that because she didn't want to start something.
Right.
She didn't start on me. So she obviously was not keen to kind of mess about in a row about that particular piece for whatever reason. And I'd be intrigued to know whether she's scared of me, or whether she thought, well, this is an academic debate where no ad hominems have been made about anyone.
Right.
They did argue, like the other GCs, academics and non-academics, said that I'd libeled Maya, because Maya wrote a big thread saying, this person has said that I should go to prison. This person has said that I should be criminalized.
Well,
which I didn't.
And Maya, I mean, she's now gone after Margaret Atwood for not returning her phone calls and so on.
Well, yeah, I mean, she's not. I want to be empathetic, and I would say that she feels under attack, and therefore she responds in a way that is understandable, but is not particularly helpful in a debate that has a lot of heat already in it, in that she has a big following and she doesn't know her own power when she sets them off. But there are academics who follow her do know their own power, and they do know what they're doing, and they still, some people, the person who called Christa a loony grad student was liking and retweeting stuff about me, including a barrister's claims that I was ludicrous but clearly vulnerable. There was a lot of the stuff that Joe was talking about around mental illness and disability, and I don't think they knew I was trans, so it automatically made me damaged and deviant and mental. But I don't think they knew that I'm autistic, that I have ADHD, and that I've been treated for PTSD. But they were still, again, quite happy to bully me, multiple academics, including, I love an emeritus because it just means retired and won't piss off. But Colin White, who people are very familiar with, in Australia, he contacted the university. Professor David Wootton, who's known for harassing women, young women in particular, but is now a single issue GC Stan account, and particularly a Kathleen account. He contacted my university and tried to get hold of personal data about me, breaking GDPR, using his professorial status to find out stuff about my PhD, which is
Trying to
and
basically
solid bills
see if you
as
could
well,
they could
you know.
mess around with your Viva and
Yeah, they wanted to, because from looking at what they'd said, like publicly, God knows what they were saying behind the scenes, but what they were happy to say in front of the world, they were like, well, they clearly didn't have their PhD at this point when they updated their LinkedIn, because they're obsessed with LinkedIn accounts and public profiles. But they've got doctor on their profile. Well, let's see. And I was perfectly clear about my status, that I'd passed my Viva and was doing my corrections, but they were trying to find out if it could be withdrawn, if they could see a copy of the thesis. That's what they were asking my department. That would have broken GDPR. I mean, it wasn't,
Sure.
and it's under embargo now to stop them just pulling it out and mocking it. Not because I've said anything untoward in it.
Yeah, I mean, your
But they were
doctorate
perfectly
is
happy
on.
to say that that the editor of Index should be sacked for publishing me in the first place. David Wootton repeatedly calls for that.
Right.
That I should never be employable in the sector.
Yeah. So this
and
gets
I've
to
applied
the
for
issue
jobs.
of like,
I've applied for jobs where I found out that people in the department subsequently were GC, and I do think it does affect my
well, because
employability.
you know what it's like inside those job talks. I mean, all you need is one person who very often won't directly say, "Oh, I'm against this person's views," but they might say, "Oh, I don't know. I mean, do they have enough publications?" Or they'll come up with an
Ironically, when I apply for these
excuse.
jobs, I've got more publications usually than the person who is meant to be my PI or my supervisor. I've got more teaching,
But still, I mean, they can come up with
you don't need to
anything.
find much in an employment market where a lot of people are going for a very few jobs, and everybody meets all of the essential criteria, and pretty much everybody meets all of the desirable criteria as well to get shortlisted.
Yeah.
But I'm aware that there are certain jobs where I was basically nailed on to be interviewable, and also under the 2 ticks scheme or whatever it's called now, disability confident, I should have been interviewed for meeting the essential criteria. Still wasn't. So I'm kind of aware that when there are people saying that I shouldn't be employed and then I don't get jobs, it's
Yeah. Well, and I suppose, Christa, this also, I'm interested in your experience as well, because it's not just sort of stock. There's also Brian Leiter, is that right?
True. Yeah, so Brian Leiter is a kind of long-term philosophy online, I don't know, feudal lord, who it's like not allowed to ever say anything negative about Brian Leiter, or he will put you on blast on his blog. Also,
he literally shot in a box, didn't he? Anyway, carry on.
Oh yeah, so there was a mysterious incident where several of his enemies received shit in the mail. But one of them was like returned address basically to Brian Leiter's. Many people took as evidence that it could not have been him, but who could say?
Okay.
It's his brain. So
but he's very happy to
surprise me.
Yeah. So he
talk about civility and.
Oh yeah. Yeah. In between the gratuitous attacks on people, he's all about civility. Sometimes during the attacks, he's like, "This person's problem is that they're not civil." Yeah, I mean,
by the way, fuck you.
I think it's not an accident that I am an American cis woman and I'm one of the people in philosophy who is like highest profile in this right now, because I don't think there's any way I could get a job in a philosophy department in the UK, no matter how impressive I was. Because I think it was just like, it's almost guaranteed to be at least one person who thinks I am like the devil in the department.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's like a whole list of people, sort of the philosophy profession in the UK basically came out with a letter that, as we talked about last time, it doesn't just say we want to respect academic freedom, but we also want to defend this premise that there's this tension between sex-based rights and gender. Like they can never hold themselves back from just being like, we want Kathleen Stock to have the right to speak, because, well, ultimately she does. But they want to say these students are not actually allowed to criticize her.
Yeah, these letters always basically involve claims about the conduct of Kathleen Stock's opponents, and people sign them with very little knowledge about what has actually happened. People are just not careful at all because they don't name people. Usually people are just not careful to sign these letters saying that all of her opponents are like being abusive or something.
Well, also just if I was trying to explain something the other day, but like my partner is very not online. He's got like the opposite of posting brain. All the GCs have posting brain, and they just can't stop posting. And if they say something wrong, they just double down rather than maybe delete for a few days, but then come back and just keep posting forever. He just isn't very online. And if he was to look up on Google or whatever, like Kathleen Stock, all of the like credible results that you would find on Google, top of Google News.
Yeah.
Even if you search Twitter and Facebook, to be fair, the things that the accounts that you would, if you weren't part of the debate, you would kind of go, oh, well, the Guardian, the Times, the Telegraph, like BBC. I'm not going to read Pink News. That's weird. Like, I'm not going to read this weird blog. Like, everything that looks credible, even if you discount Daily Mail, because they've just got like somebody on the Kathleen Stock beat now, because I'm sure they've published about 20 things about woke universities and trans people in the past just day.
Yeah.
But even if you excluded like the obvious right-wing sites, if you just looked at the quality papers, you would not know the other side. I think there's been one piece posted in the Eye that talks about the students. And
2 days ago.
2 days ago. And other than that, through the whole debate, quote unquote.
And that was from the Equalities Reporter. That was from the Equalities Reporter at the Eye News, which, I mean, I talk to people in the university and they are convinced that Kathleen Stock has actually been viciously attacked and bullied.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like, well, why wouldn't you believe that? Every single news is saying that they are.
Yeah, Question Time. Today on Politics Live, Claire Fox again brought it up out of like nowhere. It wasn't even a question about that. It was about some Hope Not Hate research about leveling up and the possibility of hate crimes and extremism happening in areas that were particularly badly affected by COVID, that already had community tensions, and therefore this could ratchet it up. And she'd go, well, you see, the thing is, in working class communities, we're not doing extremism, which is not what the research said. We don't do extremism. Where there is extremism is on university campuses. You know, Kathleen Stock was driven out of her job, and that's what, like, immediately, there was no right to reply. Obviously, it was shut down in terms of being irrelevant, but there was no, like, that's not what happened.
Well, and I think this is ultimately what we were hoping to discuss today is just kind of like, what are the facts around this, in that the student protesters, it's like, okay, you can debate whether they did the right moves or whatever, or if they had the right strategy. I think coming from the US, I saw prior to 2016, there was a lot of kind of relatively silly student protests, like counterproductive, not necessarily silly, but like there was a lot of bad optics around certain student protests that I think people learned from that experience. And it's like, students also need to learn how to communicate.
They're learning!
I know, yeah.
You have to learn by screwing up. Like, if somebody who is 45 years old went out and held one of those placards that said, suck my dick or whatever, you'd be like, come on. And to be honest, GCs do hold up way worse placards, particularly like Posey Parker's crew and the Dinosaur Collective. But yeah, I would not have personalised it to the extent.
Well, and Kathleen Stock is dropping the F-bomb everywhere,
I'm
isn't she?
41, not 18, you know? Like, how did they learn other than by doing something crass and then somebody saying, I agree with, like,
your point, but
I
maybe
agree with your right to say things, and I possibly even agree with your, like, argument, but I don't agree with the way you've done it. But unfortunately, they were just immediately called terrorists, ninjas, and just misinformation being spread by GCs who were at the event filming the students, which is really creepy. Like, Stephanie Davis-Arai from Transgender Trend was at Sussex on the campus. I mean, she does live in like Lewis, but you say it's not that far away in Sussex. But I mean, she was standing there on the campus filming the students and then lying about them while being caught on the cameras of other students who were at the event, which is so funny.
Well, but I mean, you would think it's outrageous, but they do get away with it. And I mean, and this goes actually to the point that of Christa with your Medium post that I feel like is actually just such a useful reference for people who want to just say, you know, these are the facts. This is what's sort of going on here. So you've you know, there's this claim of it's sort of Kathleen Stock is not transphobic, and that's sort of then they'll say, how can you say that when she says here that I'm not transphobic? And it's sort of like, well, you have to put this in the context, and you sort of provide really rigorously researched, you know, here's this instance and this instance and this instance, and it's organized as well. It's like the outline is ideal, but then you know, it was presented as what was it? It was like you were obsessively following her.
Yeah. So I wrote this before her book. So I talk about, and my ex-boyfriend called me a Kathleen Stock completist, which was like offensive but true. That like I read like everything that she had written online, and in the piece I talk about a number of her articles. Also, though, you know, a central part of what she was doing at the time was Twitter activism, and so I talk about a lot of her tweets, and that was stalking behavior. It turned out.
Yeah.
I had a kind of classic but nice instance of this yesterday, where John Collins, who organized the philosophers letter that just came out, that came out after the protest, not like just now, he was saying that, you know, he had heard a lot of people claiming she had said these foul things, but he hadn't been able to find what they supposedly were. And I replied and I said, I wrote this, and he said, I know. And then he said, it's an avalanche. Like, it's too much. It's like, just immediately went from like, you can't point to anything to you have pointed to too many things. And
yeah,
well, and similarly with,
or it's a generalization, but also TLDR. And
yeah.
I went back to, like, since her book came out, because obviously, like, Christa and I have read the book, and Helen Joyce's book. So, like, when people come to us, we're like, it's the same book, because, you know, there are GC academics who will say that it's rigged. Like, we understand the hacks of, you know, forming the British media that we invited that didn't turn up. We understand them all closing ranks and saying, oh, it's great, you know, my friend's book is great and whatever. But academics saying that it's rigorous, or that it doesn't say certain things, or it does say certain things, it's like, well, this is your credibility at stake, because we've read it and you are just lying about it to defend her. So when she was defaming Amelia Jones, the student at Sussex, for quite rightly saying that she'd signed the WHRC declaration and that she wanted that if you signed that, you clearly wanted the GRA repealed, the Gender Recognition Act repealed. And then Kathleen got her right to reply that she portrayed as a correction that wasn't a correction, blah, 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 whatever, semantics. I was like, I'm going to go back to the book as soon as I've got a chance. So I went back to the book in the past few days, and I was like, I'm sure she did say stuff.
Yeah, so
law. And she does. It's in obfuscatory language deliberately, but she basically kind of goes, well, if we bend the law on other characteristics a bit, so it kind of covers perception if you look enough like a woman. For it to be
and Grace gets into this as well. It's like wasn't a lie, but she made the student say
that. And for changes to the Equality Act, so that it's either very, very restrictive on gender reassignment, or that gender reassignment no longer needs to exist, because either you're perceived as a woman or man and it's covered by sex, or you're perceived as gay or lesbian.
And I feel like it is up to
which is not true.
But I feel like it is up to the media to provide that context when she says, well, I'm not transphobic, and then Amelia Jones says, well, you've signed this declaration and you're a board member of LGB, that the newspaper has to say, yes, she has signed this. So we're not going to correct the statement. We're not. They didn't even correct it. They gave her a right to reply.
But they won't take the definitions even though. So like, even if you show them that, they will go, well, that's still not transphobic. Because when I had a conversation with Martin from Index, who has been, supportive to me, and we do get on despite him being gender critical because he doesn't want to ad hominem memory or whatever. But his belief is that gender identity ideology, whatever you want to call it, they try to avoid gender ideology now if they're sane, because they know that means something else, except it's not, because gender ideology in Eastern Europe and in Latin America means exactly the same thing. It's just broader, but it still means the same thing. They think that they're not transphobic because they just are against gender identity ideology, and they don't believe that trans people should be killed individually. Like the conversation I had with
So
Martin,
that's the standard. It's a pretty low bar there.
No, literally, the conversation I had with Martin was basically like, he's also one of those kind of centrist British journalists, actually to the right people, but was New Labour, so thinks they're left, who is like, well, I don't hate Muslims and I'm not Islamophobic, but I don't like the definition of Islamophobia because I'm not against Muslims or Islam as a religion. I'm against Islamism as an ideology. And I go, well, what about when you say things about, or when journalists who take that view, like Nick Cohen or whoever, say things that are basically very Islamophobic and that are insulting towards Muslims. And he's like, well, if they're not saying it about individual Muslims, or they're not physically harming individually Muslims, and they don't want to physically harm individual Muslims, it's not Islamophobic. And that's how they feel about transphobia. So they think if you're not getting beaten up by that individual, that individual is not being transphobic. This is the thing I don't understand. That's how the British public rationalise not being racist. They go, I'm not racist, I just think they should all go back where they come from. And also just that people aren't as good.
I get that, but how do they then justify some protests and a sign against Kathleen Stock as being this kind of like pitchfork campaign that's, like if the standard was
don't ask them for consistency. They don't have any. I call them in my book. I call this kind of view of the world self-ID liberals. It comes out of Cold War liberalism that isn't actually that socially liberal, but congratulates itself for being minorly socially liberal. But it's not liberal. It doesn't think. It's basically, we're a stan of the West. We love liberal democracy. We're not that keen on anything that restricts free speech. It's sort of a bit libertarian, but it's not actually liberal. It's free for us, but not free for them. Right. And also, everybody should take on Western social and democratic norms. Right. So you can be trans, but you shouldn't try to get into any spaces, including toilets.
You can be trans and you just have normal rights that everyone else has.
Yeah, you just have normal rights everyone else has, and you should stay in your house.
Yeah.
And like, if you want to
not use public bathrooms,
fine. But if you're beaten up for it, that's your lookout, or they're probably homophobic, but probably not. We don't care. But you shouldn't try to be treated as your gender in any way. So you shouldn't be allowed to legally change your sex, because that's a legal fiction. You shouldn't be able to get other people to call you by your pronouns or treat you as your gender, because that's what Kathleen Stock calls an immersive fiction. And given that she's into extreme intentionalism, that doesn't really work out, because surely what the author
except for when she gives talks on the subject and then pretends that she wasn't there, I guess. But
yeah. So like that's their view. Like you can be. I think that their idea of trans rights is that you should not be sacked just because you're trans, and you shouldn't be killed just because you're trans. But other than that, you just have the same rights as everybody else, and you shouldn't be able to access toilets, changing rooms, any role that's reserved for people of that gender. You shouldn't be able to go to gay men's only clubs if you're a trans man. You shouldn't be asked people to use your pronouns, because they might do it for politeness. Like Kathleen Stock will personally say, ones that I encounter in person, I will use their pronouns about, which what she gets stick for people like Julia Long for things like that, because they don't think you ever should, because they all believe in that pronouns are a hypnol article that Maya loves. But I think in the general, they would rather like correctly sex somebody's pronouns. It's just they would rather be civil to somebody in person. But they think you asking somebody else to use your pronouns, or you asking somebody else to kind of talk about you as your gender is completely offensive and illiberal.
Yeah. Well, and so I don't have the sense that anyone is actually, like, I'm trying to remember who was the person who pretended that they'd gone to a kind of coffee shop and there was a trans person and they got all like their brain.
It was his wife.
It was
Yeah,
like
it was his wife. Who was it?
Gad Sad.
God Sad. Yes.
The
way-
sad man.
I mean, there's this idea that it's What did he
Does
say?
this-
Well, his podcast is just called The Sad Truth, but he said that his wife had like wanted to talk to this person, but she got too flustered because she didn't know their pronouns.
But does she address everybody in the third person?
I guess.
We'll talk about people all the time while they're there. I mean, that's the thing, because you can't really make that argument, Joe, because lots of the Mumsnet anti-pronoun people, and they've done a big thread like today where they're like, they're obsessed with not ever using pronouns at all. But they're
Cool.
like, well, why should I have to know what somebody's pronouns are? Because I only need to do that when I talk about them in the third person. Well, it doesn't work, because when you're on a conversation like this, I'll be like, oh, Eric just said something and he said.
Yeah, it just comes.
Obviously,
But also, I
you
don't
know.
think anybody's out there to be like, I really can't stand it when people accidentally make a mistake or whatever. It's like,
No, it's always,
when
it's
you
always just the intentional side.
yeah, and it's also just, if someone's actively refusing to do it in a workplace, that's harassment.
Exactly,
And-
just like it's actively harassment in the workplace if they try to get around the idea of misgendering by never ever using pronouns at all, so they'll just keep using your name in a really
Weird way.
weird way. And they
It's funny
insist
because
on
I'm down
using-
with that, really.
I know, and they use
You know?
they them for trans women, but they absolutely refuse to for any non-binary person,
Right.
which is deeply
Well,
entertaining because they're just not consistent or serious people. I don't know if Christa agrees with me, but I have lots of scholars that I disagree with, like socially, intellectually, whatever, but I cite them or don't cite them or whatever, I write against them, but their work, I can see where they got to that point, and it's consistent ideologically. Like even Nigel Biggar, like crazy as we might think his ideas are, he's consistent about, not on the free speech stuff, but he's consistent about his empire thing. He's got his thing and it makes sense, and he applies it consistently to his view of the world. The
Right.
problem with the gender critical academics and the journalists that support them, the British media that we invited, and their fans, of which there are many, and their flying monkey sock puppet accounts, is that it doesn't make sense. It's not consistent from one sentence to the next. It doesn't hold together even as a construct.
Right.
And they're just incapable of being consistent and non-hypocritical.
Yeah, I definitely share this view where, I mean, there's tons of philosophy. It tends to be fairly conservative among the humanities. It's not like mostly like Republicans, but they're like, kind of liberal, semi-conservative
We'll see,
people. But yeah, it's pretty normal. Like some very kind of offensive stuff gets published in philosophy sometimes. It's not like a particularly juicy discipline in terms of like what you are able to publish anywhere. But in general, like, yes, I didn't think that philosophers in general had good politics, but I did think that they could tell when stuff was just like totally unserious and badly argued. And this has been very disillusioning for me on that front.
Was it there's a comment section? Was that you talking about the comment section on some philosophy Daily New or something? Or?
Yeah, so it's a mess. I think that it is not representative of the discipline at this point.
Sure.
So I think kind of, it's been an open comment section where you like have to be reasonable and like reasonably polite, but you can like promote whatever view for a while. And I think people just got tired of the same arguments with the same people all the time, kind of like the reactionary side won and are continuing to do their like reasonable thing.
Right.
But yeah, it's just a mess.
Yeah, so someone made a point that, the way that they argue, it's just, if you refute one of the claims, they abandon it and move on. And I find, you know,
It's
you start
impossible.
you start a discussion about something, and then maybe start to have a bit of a discussion, and then all of a sudden they're just sort of like, "What's your definition of woman? What's your definition of woman?" And it's a bit like we were talking about something totally separate from that,
Yeah,
Well, they
and
also
then they're
change
like,
their
"Oh yeah,
phrases all the
I
time.
see. You're
Their
just
definition of what a woman was, and
Isn't
Kristen
that
knows from
sea
Kathleen's
lining?
book. There's loads of different definitions of gender
It's
in
sea
there.
lining, right?
Yeah, it's sea lining, but I mean, like, they can't actually come up with a definition of woman
that's not the dictionary.
that works
Yeah.
for themselves, like that works better than anyone who says they're a woman is a woman. They have to kind of go, oh well, let's blah 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 blah. Oh wait, that doesn't work.
Large
because
gametes.
some people don't have exactly. So they used to kind of go adult human female, and we go, hang on, the dictionary definition was adult female human. You've just gone weird in order to brand it and make it
Yeah.
sound alien.
Adult human
and then
chicken.
trans women went, well, we're adult, we're humans, clearly, and we're also female because look at me, look how the world treats me as well as how I think of myself. I am an adult human female. So we go, oh right, so it's not adult human female. So it's people who have are of the biological sex class women, and then so trans women will go, well, my bloods like look identical biologically to a cis woman's, and lots of other parts of my body and tissues and stuff like that do. Like you couldn't necessarily tell without karyotyping me. Have you karyotyped yourself? Do you know? And they'd be like, no, I haven't karyotyped myself. Large immobile gametes. And then people go, well, not everyone's
the cervix. They were
large
asking all
immobile
the
gametes. And then they'll go, well, a body that is capable, has been designed. They end up getting into this kind of ontological, teleological shit. They get very philosophical for people who aren't philosophers.
Yes.
And then go, it's a body that was designed with the capability to produce it, even if they can't or they no longer can. And then you go, well, you might as well just say, like, because the magic man Jesus God decided to make man and woman, and men are like this, and then like unless you are of a descendant of Adam and Eve, and unless you are of the sex class of Eve who ate the apple, like, that's kind of the line of inquiry they're going down. Like they can't make it work.
But were you made from a rib?
Well,
were
yes,
you made
but
from
also
a rib?
like just in purely feminist terms, and this is why it's funny with the leading academic GCs is that only a couple of them are actually feminists.
Oh yeah.
Have a history of feminist scholarship. The rest of them have never started. They've never done the reading.
Years into claiming it as what they're doing, they haven't read the.
Yeah, they're called feminists, but they haven't. Like none of their work is feminist work. They'll slag off Sally Hines, but her work is based on feminist.
Well, there was that Butler.
And it is, yeah, exactly. So that like the only person who really has done feminist work is Selena Todd, and she seems to have backed out of that. Like anyway, but if you actually look at feminist scholarship, they were talking, years and years and years ago against biological essentialism, including people who were anti-pomo, post-structuralism, Butler, whatever you want to talk about. Because if you go all the way back to Wollstonecraft, which predates all of that stuff, she was talking about the aristocracy of sex and wanting to destroy it. The whole point of the people who are fighting for suffrage and for early feminism is that they wanted to destroy sex classes, not ratify them. So it's like they've gone against everything that feminism was trying to do. And then second wave feminism, apart from the little segment that was trans exclusionary, were trying to get away from the restrictions of biology, of being defined by their reproductive capacity or lack thereof. They were trying to get away from that. So all of these people who've suddenly discovered, oh, I'm a feminist now, they're not. I mean, they haven't even read the TERFs. They haven't even read Janice Raymond. They haven't even read Sheila Jeffrey. Like, they haven't read
you would love these people. You should read them. You would like them. Why would you read them?
They would love it. They would find it. They would find it a bit rude and extreme, but I mean, they would like it.
Well, and because
isn't there can't be asked. Do you know what I mean? It's quite funny.
Well, because isn't there's like always a tradition within feminism of, certain variants have been trans exclusionary at different points. I mean, but I think what's different is the way that position is represented as a feminist position. There's a kind of reification of feminism as being
it's like feminists
because these are women and they've said they
most
represent
of the trans
women.
People have read all of the feminism, and most feminists are trans inclusive. Like the women of Mumsnet who are trad wives, like literally, like every way they describe themselves, or Mary Harrington, who calls herself a reactionary feminist, and who's been speaking at the National Conservatism Conference, which isn't just a conservatism conference in a nation. It's about national conservatism, which is what Orban does. Like,
Right,
it's,
right.
Yeah, she's like having babies and like, yeah.
she wrote an article like this week today that is, which is based on her talk there, which is having babies is great. Men and women are different.
Yeah.
If you enjoy sex, you're weird.
Well, and I think
sex positivism destroyed everything. Like, those people are called feminists, and Christa is not called a feminist, even though she is a cis woman who has read the feminism. Because
I got kicked out.
And I'm not feminist, even though I've done feminist activism and read all of the feminism. I've done lots of feminist activism that has nothing to do with trans stuff over many, many years because I'm trans.
Well, because I didn't know if you realized, but Jane Claire Jones is now in charge of the register. And if you get off the list,
rock me out.
And the thing is, she's a post-structuralist because she's Derrida stan.
Yeah.
Prints in her spine. Like, she may hate Foucault, and I've read her thesis. My God, like that makes Helen Joyce's writing look good.
She's a handful.
Like, that is barely coherent, and I would also gets Foucault wrong. But they all do.
But yeah, I mean, anyway, I mean, I think we're already a bit over time, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'm really grateful to everyone for kind of joining us. But I think what we've realized is that there is actually probably room for debate, and actually that's what Grace concluded as well yesterday. Is just this idea that there's no engagement amongst, for example, Christa, you're really, why call it obsessive? Just call it thorough and complete, right? It's like here's citations and references.
Constantly. We're in debate with the issues. I think that what they should do is speak and talk about being silent less and listen and read more. Because if they actually read more, rather than just scraping anything that's read by the other side to look for something to mock and then just get back to their usual posting what is a woman, then they might actually have some valid academic debate, some valid social
don't
debate,
pretend like you don't have time to read Butler in The Guardian for like 2 pages. I mean,
it's too hard.
Butler is not hard.
Hadley Freeman was trying to define what fascism is to Judith Butler. Somebody who
I wouldn't know, because
quite a lot about fascism outside of The Guardian.
Hadley blocked me because I told her she was obsessed with pubic hair, which she is. So I didn't see that.
Wow.
I just think they should all have a wank, which I know they think is very coarse and terrible.
Well, they hate asexuals now as well, Phoenix, remember?
But they don't like sex.
Oh, that's right, the girl guides.
Apart from the duty sex that Sarah Deaton thinks you should have. And they just seem quite angry and sad. Like, the thing is, your average trans person or your average person who is cis, who engages in this debate from the inclusive side, writes about like a range of topics. Like, even Christa supposedly obsessed with stock. Like, there's a lot of dog content.
That's not your topic. That's not your thesis.
It's not even my dissertation.
The actual dissertation. Like, I write about a load of topics. Joe writes a load of topics. Eric of the North, who
there is a lot of dogs here too.
I keep on being told like you tell me which page. And
predatory misogynist obsessed with gender.
I'm reading about 19th century Germany.
It's not our main thing for any of us. It's not the main thing any of us are known for in normal life. Whereas those people, they can't go more than 10 seconds in the supermarket without going shit.
Particularly if they go down the
charity
route.
said something trans inclusive. I better jump on it and ask them what a woman is.
Yeah.
Like, they don't have any other hobbies, so I would just like them to diversify their interests a little bit.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think part of
by reading. Initially, just reading.
Sure.
I think they're like willing to have a debate with people about like, what a woman is, right? I think the problem is that this is fake, right? Like there's this, I think clearly could have a concept that was like, we could have a society that was trans exclusionary, right? And like only would admit this concept that didn't include trans people. Or we could also clearly have concepts that are trans inclusive. Clearly people are all over the place using concepts that are trans inclusive. And there's this idea that like we're going to find the answer about whether trans people get to be included and whether trans people get to live their genders by like looking really hard at the definition of the word. It's just not going to happen, right? We're deciding how the world is. We're not just like doing this deep dive into the definition of a term. It's just not going to like singularly.
Same when it comes to debating rights. So like when we were looking to repeal Section 28 in the first term of the New Labour term of government, Baroness Young and other homophobic reactionary conservatives were like, we need more debate because we keep being called bigots. We need more debate. And that's not how we solved Section 28. We just went, it's wrong. And LGBTQ plus people need to have rights, and they need to be taught about all of the diversity of relationships that exist. So like there are people who genuinely think, who aren't GC committed, who are both sides liberals, who are like, well, maybe if we discussed it more, we could come to some sort of compromise. But the only compromise the gender criticals want is for us to give up all of our rights.
Yeah, right.
Like, it's not like you can find some middle ground where you go, well, you'll let trans women into women's toilets, but only on a Tuesday, and never into.
They need wristbands and things to
like,
go into.
The things that are genuinely sensitive are all case by case anyway. Sports case by case. It has eligibility criteria, but it's case by case in terms of selection, and therefore those sensitive things can be discussed then. Refugees are case by case.
Yeah.
Domestic violence.
No one is actually these practical.
It sometimes goes wrong, but all of the stuff that people really have proper, genuine fears about, as opposed to irrational fears about, they're all case by case.
Yeah, and no one, I think, is.
We've had years of discussion about it. If you want to debate whether whether hate crime should exist as a thing at all. We can debate that. Who does it protect? Yeah. Should misogyny be a hate crime or not? How do you want to define misogyny? Is it on perception? Is it not? Those are things that are interesting to discuss.
Is it any time a man participates in the GC debates, is that misogyny?
This is what they will not debate, right? They want to talk so much about how they want to debate, and what they want to debate is like what a woman is. But then what they actually spend all their time talking about is just like asserting that their view is not transphobic, and that they will not debate. You are not allowed to express the opposing view on that, right? If you try to argue for the view that like, yes, in fact, this is transphobic, that is what they think. Like, they do not think that you should be allowed to do that at a university, right? That view should not be allowed to be expressed.
Racist.
Yeah,
it's
the same structure.
In today's Unheard says, obviously it goes on about stock and defend stock again, but it also goes, I understand this myself, because just because I said anti-racist activism had gone too far or was a bit extreme, I was called racist. Of course you were called racist. You said anti-racist. It's
That's
like the
view.
In America.
Yeah, what's the opposite of anti-racist?
What's the opposite of Antifa? It's fascist, right? You can debate tactics, but if you're like Antifa are bad or Antifa have gone too far in their resisting racism, you're a fascist. It's like in the definition. It's not like woman. It's not contested. No. It's like,
but what does Hadley Freeman say a fascist is though, Phoenix? Because that's who gets to decide.
It's only the shower, and it's only at that specific.
I feel like the only person who's going to settle this for them is Merriam and Webster. And just until we get the dictionary, but then if that changed, then it would be because
that's the other thing. They don't seem
conspiracy
to
of Stonewall.
The whole point of the dictionary is that words change their meaning via use.
Sure.
They're not fixed. We're not the Académie Française. In English, the words change their meaning.
Well, unfortunately, I think we're well out of time. We could have kept going we could go for
I've almost deplatformed my dinner. Look at that.
But I'm sure we'll keep the conversation going on Twitter. We'll also
another half hour yet, apparently.
We'll be airing Grace's interview in full without the sort of speed video version and the sort of Buster Keaton version, and but we'll because that was very interesting. And Christa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And
it's lovely to meet you in like.
Yeah.
And
and
Phoenix, thank you for coming back for the live show this evening.
Yeah, no doubt my hate watchers will have some very interesting screenshots and comments about what bullies we are.
And Woke Sorcerer, always a pleasure.
Thanks. Nice to see everybody. Thank you,
See you
Christa.
soon, everyone.
Good to see you again, Phoenix. Enjoy your tea.
What kind of a world is it? The only one who can't say what he thinks is the one
Huh?
Free speech.